Fame generates letters, thousands of them, tens of thousands across the course of a successful career, handwritten and typed, brief and pages long, arriving in envelopes from every country where the music has reached and from every kind of person the music has touched. Most of them say similar things in the particular vocabulary that fans develop for communicating with people they have never met but feel, through sustained attention to their work, that they know. They say, "Your music means everything to me." They say, "I have been listening since the beginning." They say, "I saw you perform and it changed something I cannot explain." These are not small statements. They are genuine expressions of something real, the specific personal impact that a voice can have on a life when the voice arrives at the right moment with the right song. Michael Bublé's team. Read these letters with care and responded to as many as the scale of the correspondence allowed. The letters mattered, but most of them, in the honest arithmetic of a career producing thousands of pieces of fan mail a year, looked more or less like the others. They contained the same warmth, the same vocabulary, the same genuine but difficult to distinguish expression of love for the music. One letter in 2010 did not look like the others. It arrived in a plain white envelope, handwritten in the careful but slightly unsteady script of someone who was not young and who had taken time with the writing, who had written and perhaps rewritten, chosen words with a deliberateness that the final product reflected. The return address was a small town in Ontario. The name on the envelope was Arthur Whitfield. He was 78 years old and he had never written a fan letter in his life before this one, and he had spent 3 days deciding whether to send it. Michael Bublé's assistant, a woman named Rachel Cole, who had worked for him for 4 years and had developed, through the daily practice of reading his correspondence, a precise instinct for which letters required more than a form response, read Arthur's letter, set it aside, read it again, and then walked it directly to Michael. She did not explain why she was bringing it to his attention rather than adding it to the stack of correspondence that would be addressed in the ordinary way. She simply handed it to him and said, "You should read this one yourself." Arthur Whitfield had lived in the same house in Guelph, Ontario for 41 years. He had moved there in 1969 with his wife Margaret, who had been 26 at the time, and had chosen the house because of the large maple tree in the backyard, which she had declared immediately and without qualification to be the most beautiful tree she had ever seen. Arthur had not particularly noticed the maple tree. He had noticed that Margaret loved it, which was sufficient reason to agree that the house was the right house. They had lived in it through the raising of 2 children, a son named Daniel who now lived in Calgary and called every Sunday, and a daughter named Susan who lived 40 minutes away and came for dinner most Thursdays. Through 41 years of ordinary life in a house that was, like most ordinary houses, made extraordinary by the people inside it. Through the specific accumulation of shared experience that constitutes a long marriage, the arguments that resolved and the ones that didn't, the celebrations and the losses, the gradual deepening of understanding that comes from being in the same space as another person for long enough to know them in the way that time and proximity and consistent attention produce. Margaret had died 14 months before Arthur wrote the letter. She had been 75. The illness had not been sudden. There had been 2 years of gradual progression that had given them time to say the things that needed saying, time to be with each other in the specific, focused way that people are sometimes with each other when they understand that time is finite and the finite has arrived. This was a kind of grace, Arthur understood, not the grace of an easy loss, but the grace of a prepared one. He was grateful for it in the abstract and devastated by it in the particular, which is the specific condition of grief that does not resolve cleanly and does not ask permission to continue. Past what seems like a reasonable duration, he lived alone in the house now. Daniel called every Sunday. Susan came most Thursdays. The maple tree in the backyard continued its annual cycles without reference to the change in the house's occupancy. Arthur made his own breakfast and watched the morning news and walked to the library on Tuesdays when the weather permitted and read in the evenings, because reading had always been something he and Margaret did together, and doing it alone was not the same thing but was better than not doing it. He managed. Managing was what was available. He had discovered Michael Bublé's music by accident, the way most people discover things that become important to them, not through a deliberate search, but through a random encounter that lands differently than random encounters usually do. Margaret had been alive. It was late. In the second year of her illness, when the progression had made the future narrow enough to require the particular attention that narrowing futures demand. They had been in the car, driving home from a medical appointment that had contained information they were still processing in silence. The radio was on not because either of them had turned it on specifically, but because the radio was always on in the car, background to the driving, background to the silence that was not empty but full of things they had not yet found words for. And then a song came on, "Haven't Met You Yet." Arthur did not know who was singing. He did not know the song. He knew, in the moment he heard the first few bars, that something about it required attention, that the voice carrying the melody was doing something with it that the melody alone could not account for, that the warmth in the sound was not incidental to its effect but the whole mechanism of it. Margaret reached over and turned up the volume. She did not say anything. She turned up the volume the way you turn up the volume when something has arrived that deserves more room than it has been given, and she listened to the rest of the song with the specific quality of attention she brought to things she was taking seriously. When it ended, she said, "I love that." She said it simply without elaboration, the way she said things when the elaboration was unnecessary because the thing was self-evident. Arthur asked the radio station what the song was when the DJ announced it. He filed the name Michael Bublé, "Haven't Met You Yet," in the part of his memory reserved for things Margaret had loved. He bought the album the following week, not for himself or not. Primarily for himself, he bought it because Margaret had said "I love that," and buying the album was a way of honoring what she had said, of treating her response to the music as the important thing it was. He played it in the car on the drives to and from the medical appointments that continued through the following months. He played it in the house in the evenings. Margaret hummed along sometimes. She could not always sing. There were days when her energy was directed entirely toward other requirements, but she hummed. And the humming was its own language, its own form of saying, "I am still here, this still reaches me, the music is still doing what music does." She died in the spring. The album continued. Arthur played it in the evenings, after Daniel's Sunday calls and after Susan's Thursday dinners, in the specific quiet of a house that had contained two people for 41 years and now contained one. The music was not comfort in the clean, resolving sense. It did not make the loss smaller or the absence less present. But it was the music Margaret had loved, discovered in a car on the way home from a medical appointment while they were still in the process of understanding what the future was going to require, and listening to it was a way of being with her, not the mystical way that grief sometimes imagines, but the simple, concrete way of occupying the same space as something she had chosen to love. Arthur wrote the letter on a Tuesday at the kitchen table in 3 drafts. The first draft was too long. The second draft was too cold. He had overcompensated for the emotion of the first by removing too much of what made the letter worth writing. The third draft found the balance, honest, without being excessive, personal without being intrusive, saying what needed to be said without requiring anything in return for the saying. He wrote, "I am 78 years old and I have never written a letter like this before. My wife Margaret died 14 months ago. She loved your music, specifically the song Haven't Met You Yet, which she heard for the first time in our car on the way home from a medical appointment, and which she asked me to turn up on the radio because she wanted more of it. I bought the album the next week and we listened to it together until she could no longer listen. I still play it in the evenings. I wanted you to know that the song is still here, that you are still here in the sense that matters. I am not asking you for anything. I simply thought you should know, because people who make things that help other people through the worst available circumstances deserve to understand the dimensions of what they have made. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for recording it. Thank you for whatever it costs you to put that kind of warmth into a sound and send it into the world where people like Margaret and me could find it when we needed it most." He addressed the envelope to Michael Bublé's management company, whose address he found on the internet with the assistance of his daughter Susan, who had come for Thursday dinner and had helped him locate it without asking too many questions about why he wanted it. He put a stamp on the envelope. He held it for a moment, and then he walked to the mailbox at the end of his street and put it in. He told no one he had sent it. He did not expect a response. He had written it because the writing of it was what the situation required. Because there was something that needed to be said, and he was the person who needed to say it, and because Margaret, who had always believed in the importance of acknowledging the things that mattered, would have approved. He went home, he made tea, he read. The letter was gone, and he felt, having sent it, that something had been completed that had been quietly open. Rachel Cole read Arthur's letter on a Thursday morning in the management office, approximately 3 weeks after it had been mailed. She was not easily moved by fan mail, not because she was indifferent to it, but because 4 years of reading it had given her a calibrated understanding of its range, and most of it, however genuine, occupied a fairly predictable emotional register. Arthur's letter occupied a different register. It was not asking for anything. It was not performing grief. For effect, it was the careful, honest account of a 78-year-old man telling an artist something specific about what a song had done in a specific set of circumstances, offered as information rather than appeal, in the language of someone who had thought carefully about whether to say it and had decided that saying it was the right thing to do. She read it twice. Then she walked it to Michael. Michael read it at his desk without interruption from beginning to end. He did not skim. He read it with the full attention that it had been written with, giving the letter the quality of reception that its quality of composition had earned. When he finished, he sat with it for a moment in the way he sat with things that required time before response. Then he looked at Rachel and said, "Find him." That was all. 2 words, the specificity of the instruction, not find his address, not send a form response, not acknowledge the letter through the management company's standard channels, communicated everything it needed to communicate. Rachel Cole, who had worked for him for 4 years and understood the difference between an instruction and a request, nodded and went to find Arthur Whitfield of Guelph, Ontario. Arthur was in the backyard when the phone rang. He had been looking at the maple tree, still bare in the early spring, the specific skeletal beauty of a large tree before it leaves, the kind of sight that Margaret had never failed to notice and comment on at this time of year. He came inside and picked up the phone and said hello, and a woman's voice said, "Mr. Whitfield, my name is Rachel Cole. I work with Michael Bublé. He asked me to call you." Arthur sat down, not because his legs had given way. He was in better physical condition than many men of 78, but because sitting felt appropriate to the magnitude of what had just been said. He said, "I see," which was the first thing available. Rachel explained that Michael had read his letter, that he had read it personally, that he had asked her to call to say, and here Rachel paused, in the way people pause when they are conveying something from someone else and want to be certain they convey it accurately, that the letter had meant something to him, that he was grateful Arthur had written it, that he was sorry about Margaret, and that he would like to speak with Arthur directly if Arthur was willing to receive a call. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes, I think I would like that very much." Michael called that evening. Arthur's daughter, Susan, happened to be there for Thursday dinner when the phone rang, and she witnessed what followed, not the content of the conversation, which Arthur conducted in the privacy of the small sitting room, while Susan remained in the kitchen in the particular discreet way of a woman who understood that what was happening in the next room was not hers to overhear, but the fact of it. Her father's voice through the wall, speaking for nearly 40 minutes with someone she would not have expected to be on the other end of that call. The specific content of the conversation between Michael Bublé and Arthur Whitfield is known only to the two of them, which is how it should be. What Susan observed when her father came out of the sitting room after 40 minutes was a man whose expression she had not seen in 14 months, not happy exactly, not the uncomplicated happiness of someone who has received good news, but something more specific and more durable, the specific quality of someone who has been fully heard, who has said something important to someone who received it with full attention and responded in kind, who has been in the presence of another person's genuine interest and genuine acknowledgement and has come away from that presence with something that the months of managing had not provided. He sat down at the kitchen table. Susan sat across from him. She did not ask questions. She understood from the expression on his face and from the quality of the silence he brought with him from the sitting room that questions were not what the moment required. She simply sat with him the way she came every Thursday, the way she had always come. After a while, Arthur said he asked about her. He asked about Margaret. He wanted to know what she was like, and I told him. He said it with a quality of wonderment that Susan had not heard from him in 14 months. the wonderment of someone who has been given something they had not known they were still capable of receiving. What can be inferred from what Arthur has shared in the years since with Susan and Daniel and the small circle of people who knew the full story is this. Michael had asked him about Margaret with the specific, genuine curiosity of someone who wanted to know about the person rather than to process the grief of the person's absence. He had asked what she was like, what she had loved, what she had been like in the car that day when the song came on. Arthur had told him. And Michael had listened, not with the performed attentiveness of a celebrity managing a challenging interaction, but with the genuine listening of someone who understood that the 78-year-old man on the other end of the line was telling him something real and important and deserved to be heard completely. He had also said something to Arthur that Arthur has repeated in the years since to the people he is closest to, something about what it means to make music. Something about why the making of it is worth the cost, not the financial cost or the logistical cost, but the personal cost of putting something genuinely felt into a public form and releasing it into the world without knowing who will receive it or when or under what circumstances. He had said, "I never know where the songs end up, who they find, what they're doing when they arrive. What you've told me tonight is the reason I keep writing them." Michael Bublé has spoken, across many interviews and many years, about his understanding of what music is for. He has described it consistently in terms of connection between the performer and the audience, between the song and the specific moment in a listener's life when the song arrives, between the warmth in the voice and the need for warmth in the person receiving it. He has described the standards he loves, the Sinatra songs and the Cole songs, and the songs his grandfather played on the turntable in Burnaby, as a language, a vocabulary for feeling that exceeded what ordinary words could carry. Arthur Whitfield's letter confirmed something about that language that Michael had understood intellectually, but had not, until the letter arrived, understood in the specific, particular human way that understanding becomes when it is not abstract but embodied in a single person's account of a single experience. He knew that the music reached people. He knew that it arrived in moments of difficulty and provided something. He had read thousands of letters that told him so, but Arthur's letter was different because it was not about the general experience of being moved by music. It was about a specific car on a specific afternoon with a specific woman who turned up the radio and said simply, "I love that," and then listened, and then hummed, and then died in the spring. And then was still somehow present in the evenings when her husband of 41 years played the album she had loved, alone in the house they had shared, under the maple tree she had chosen. That specificity, the maple tree, the car, the radio, the 3 drafts of the letter, the Tuesday walk to the mailbox, was what made the letter different from the thousands of others. It was not about Michael Bublé. It was about Margaret Whitfield, and in being about Margaret, it was about everything that music is actually for. The specific human lives that it finds, the specific human moments it illuminates, the specific human grief it cannot resolve but can accompany with warmth and presence, and the quality of understanding that the best music carries regardless of whether the person who made it ever knew who was listening. Arthur Whitfield is in his mid-80s now. He still lives in the house in Guelph with the maple tree in the backyard. Daniel still calls every Sunday. Susan still comes most Thursdays. The rhythms of the managed life continue, the library on Tuesdays, the reading in the evenings, the morning news, the annual spectacle of the maple tree leafing in the spring and turning in the autumn, and standing bare through the winter in the way that trees stand bare through winters. Which is to say simply and completely, without apology for the absence of what they will eventually return. He still plays Michael Bublé's music in the evenings. Not every evening. There are evenings when the silence is what is needed, when the absence is the thing being attended to rather than supplemented, but often. The album Margaret heard for the first time in a car on an afternoon that was difficult in all the ways that some afternoons are difficult, and turned up the radio for, and said simply, "I love that." The album that Arthur bought the following week as an act of love for someone who could not buy it for herself. The album that played in the evenings through the months that followed, accompanying the humming that was her way of saying she was still there, still reachable by the music, still present in the room where it was playing. He spoke to Michael Bublé once on a Thursday evening in the spring for nearly 40 minutes. He told him about Margaret, what she was like, what she loved, how she had looked in the car that afternoon when the song came on and she reached over and turned up the volume without a word. Michael listened. He asked questions. He said what he said about why he kept writing the songs. Arthur thanked him. Michael thanked Arthur. The call ended. Arthur went back to the kitchen and sat with Susan and did not try to explain what had happened, because some things that happen are better received than explained. Susan sat with him in the comfortable silence of a daughter who has been coming every Thursday for long enough to understand when silence is the right response. The maple tree was beginning to show the first pale green of early spring through the kitchen window. Margaret had always loved that moment, the specific instant when the first leaves appeared and the tree stopped being bare and became, again, the most beautiful tree she had ever seen. Arthur looked at it for a long time. Then he got up and put on the kettle. The music was still there. Margaret was still there, in the way that the people we love are still there, in the songs they loved, in the trees they chose, in the evenings where their absence is the shape of their continuing presence.